Welcome to Last Moments. Join me as I uncover the cases of the worst food deaths ever in American history. From a man who bought a luxury bird's nest through an illegal supplier, to a businessman who celebrated New Year's over a luxury seafood dinner, only for a lobster sauce to expose the problem in the worst possible way. It was October 19, 2019, in a gated waterfront property outside Miami, Florida. Inside a modern mansion overlooking the bay, Joshua Monroe Jr. was preparing a private dinner built around a dish that very few people in the United States had ever tasted. Joshua was 35 years old and made his money through a network of questionable investments, shell companies, and business ventures that rarely survived close scrutiny. He enjoyed expensive things, but more than that, he enjoyed owning things other people could not get. Rare watches, rare liquor, rare cars. If something was difficult to obtain, Joshua wanted it. A few weeks earlier, his business partner, Robin Thomas, 30 years old, had told him about edible bird's nest soup, a luxury dish made from the nests of swiftlets and often sold for thousands of dollars per pound. Robin described it as a delicacy consumed by wealthy collectors and business elites throughout parts of Asia. Reading this, I can tell that Robin was certain that Joshua would be interested enough to try his suggestion. Robin happened to know someone who could source bird's nests outside normal import channels. Through that contact, the two were introduced to an unofficial supplier who claimed to have access to wild cave-harvested nests collected from remote limestone caves. Joshua immediately preferred the idea over commercially available products. To him, the appeal was not just the dish itself, but the fact that it came from a source most people could never access. Within days, he purchased several nests through the supplier. He invited Robin to his house for a private tasting, eager to show off what he believed was a far more authentic product than anything available through legal distributors. Then, on the day of the dinner, Robin canceled. A scheduling conflict came up at the last minute, and he told Joshua he would have to reschedule. Joshua decided to continue without him. That evening, Joshua prepared the bird's nest soup himself using instructions he had found online. His usual house staff had been given the night off because the dinner was intended to be a private meeting between him and Robin. With Robin canceling only a few hours beforehand, Joshua saw no reason to call everyone back in. The nests looked unusual, darker and rougher than the photographs he had seen from commercial suppliers, but he took that as proof of authenticity rather than a warning sign. And that must be the first sign that he overlooked. He should have questioned it, but he didn't. He ate alone. Within several hours, Joshua developed a severe headache, dizziness, and unusual fatigue. He initially dismissed the symptoms as dehydration or exhaustion. As the night progressed, his condition worsened. His breathing became increasingly difficult despite no obvious obstruction, and he began experiencing confusion and weakness. By the early hours of the morning, he was struggling to remain conscious. No emergency call was made. Joshua was found the following afternoon after employees became concerned when repeated calls went unanswered. Responding authorities discovered him deceased inside the residence. The medical examination identified fatal methemoglobinemia caused by severe nitrite poisoning. Investigators initially believed the contamination had originated from the birds' nests themselves and treated the case as a food safety incident, as improperly processed cave-harvested nests can naturally contain elevated nitrite levels. The case initially appeared to be a fatal food poisoning incident. That changed when detectives traced the purchase back to the supplier introduced through Robin Thomas. Financial records revealed that Robin owed Joshua a substantial amount of money through failed business ventures and private loans. Investigators later uncovered communications showing that Robin had deliberately contaminated the birds' nests with concentrated sodium nitrite before delivering them to Joshua. Laboratory testing confirmed nitrite concentrations far beyond what could occur naturally. Robin was later convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. The investigation also exposed several illegal financial activities connected to both men. Multiple businesses were shut down, assets were seized, and additional criminal charges were filed against several associates tied to their operations. It was August 14, 2013. Okavango Delta, Botswana, a remote safari lodge sitting deep within one of the most isolated stretches of the delta. The nearest facility capable of advanced medical intervention was not close, Reaching it required evacuation by air. The lodge was surrounded by water and floodplain on every side. There was no other way in or out quickly. Nathan Cole was 42. He had a documented severe shellfish allergy that had been part of his medical history since childhood. He had been hospitalized following exposure more than once. He wore a medical alert bracelet. He carried an EpiPen. His wife knew the symptoms and knew what to do if something went wrong. The allergy was not a background detail in his life. It was something he and the people around him managed actively and took seriously. His caution had always been focused on obvious shellfish dishes. He had never extended that caution to how unrelated dishes might be prepared in the same kitchen, what stocks were used, or what surfaces and utensils had handled shellfish before anything else was prepared on them. He and his wife had planned the trip for months. It was their 10-year anniversary. The Okavango Delta had been on their list for a long time, and this was the year they had committed to it. They were 3 days into a multi-day safari experience when the evening of August 14th arrived. The lodge operated on a fixed meal service with limited substitution options. The kitchen prepared what was on the menu, and guests ate what was put in front of them. Nathan had eaten at the lodge without incident for 2 evenings prior. The meals had been straightforward, and nothing in the first 2 days had given him cause for concern. That pattern had made the third evening feel no different from the ones before it. The chef announced turtle soup as part of the evening meal. Nathan did not associate the dish with any shellfish risk. It was not a shellfish dish in any category he recognized as dangerous. He did not ask about the ingredients. He did not ask how it had been prepared or what stock the kitchen had used. The soup was served and he consumed it. Remote lodge kitchens routinely prepare stock in bulk at the start of the day and use it across multiple dishes as a cost and logistics measure. The kitchen at this lodge had prepared a seafood stock base earlier that day using prawns and crayfish. That same stock had been used in the preparation of the turtle soup. There was no separation between the two. The cross-contact was not incidental. It was built into how the kitchen operated. No allergen information had been communicated to guests about shared preparation bases. Within the first 5 minutes of finishing the soup, Nathan's throat tightened, and a general discomfort set in. He did not immediately identify it as an allergic reaction. The dish had not registered as a risk, and that assumption created a delay. Over the following 5 to 10 minutes, the symptoms intensified. Breathing became more restricted. By the time the reaction was recognized for what it had already progressed beyond its early stage. The EpiPen was administered, but only a single dose was available, and there was no second injector on hand. The lodge had no intravenous access or advanced medical capability on site. Staff contacted emergency evacuation services immediately after the EpiPen was administered. The lodge's location required an air response, and the dispatch window for a night evacuation in that part of the Delta added time that could not be recovered. The nearest facility equipped to manage severe anaphylaxis was over an hour away by air under favorable conditions. Nathan Cole's condition continued to deteriorate, and he was pronounced deceased before evacuation could be completed. Cause of death was severe anaphylaxis following shellfish allergen exposure via cross-contact in shared kitchen stock, compounded by delayed epinephrine administration and the absence of advanced medical care in a remote setting.
It was October 5th, 2013, inside a packed sports bar on the outskirts of Tampa, Florida. The place was loud and cramped, with every TV blasting a different game and the smell of fried food hanging thick in the air. A small stage had been set up near the bar, and a crowd had gathered around it, phones out and recording. To kill time before his shift, 27-year-old Steven Penner was hanging around the bar with a few coworkers. Steven was a low-key warehouse worker who'd spent years quietly saving up for a down payment on a used truck. He was a quiet, intensely focused guy who never cared about being the center of attention. The only reason he was even there that night was that his coworkers wouldn't stop hyping up the bar's infamous wing challenge. His main goal was the cash prize, which for him was basically the difference between waiting another 6 months for that truck and driving off the lot that weekend. Steven wasn't a big spice guy, but he figured he could push through anything for a few $100. Winning that prize meant everything to him. The challenge was simple on paper. 12 wings coated in a house blend built around ghost pepper and habanero extract, eaten within 10 minutes. But for me, this was already a total recipe for disaster. The bar had posted standard waivers and warnings, but let's be real, the staff treated the whole thing like a fun gimmick night and nothing more. And look, I get why people line up for these things. The crowd was buzzing, people were cheering, and the bartender had a stopwatch ready. There was zero medical staff on site, just a manager filming for the bar's social media and a stack of napkins on standby. Steven started off strong, but by wing number 8, the heat had completely taken over. His eyes were watering, his face was bright red, and he was visibly struggling. Witnesses said he was gagging between bites but kept shoving wings into his mouth, barely chewing, just trying to beat the clock. Right after he finished the 12th wing, Steven threw his hands up to celebrate, but within seconds, his body completely rejected it, and he doubled over, vomiting onto the floor. Then came the absolute worst part. In the middle of throwing up, he took a sharp, sudden gasp of air. That breath pulled the vomit, along with a small chunk of wing bone he hadn't fully cleared, straight down into his windpipe. Witnesses on the cell phone video heard a horrible, wet, choking sound before he dropped to one knee. Honestly, it completely blows my mind that for a second, everyone around him actually assumed he was sweating it out or overwhelmed by the heat, until his pale face went and collapsed flat on the floor. Emergency service were called, and when paramedics came, they used a suction tool, but the bone fragment and stomach contents were packed deep in his airway, completely blocking his breathing. Steven went into cardiac arrest right there on the bar floor. The medical examiner ruled the death an asphyxiation caused by airway obstruction and aspiration of food material. The report noted that the wing bone had become wedged in a way that made it difficult to clear on his own. Afterward, the bar permanently canceled the wing challenge. Steven's family asked that the prize money be donated to a local trade school scholarship fund in his name. I still think about how Steven's family turned that cash prize into a scholarship, but the next story proves that even something as simple as a scoop of ice cream can turn into a fight for your last breath.
It was August 18th, 2016, in Bangkok, Thailand. Heat still hung over the apartment blocks past midnight, while dripping air conditioners echoed through Bangkok's narrow alleys. Small kitchens stayed busy as exhausted workers came home looking for cheap late-night meals before the neighborhood slowly went quiet. That night, Niran Sopa, 22, barely had time to sleep. He attended community college during the day and worked overnight at a convenience store. The pay covered rent and part of his tuition, but not much else. Co-workers described him as polite, exhausted, and always moving between school and work without stopping. He sounded like a lot of students in Bangkok trying to survive 1 week at a time. Like many people living in smaller apartments, Niran relied heavily on leftovers to save money. His refrigerators were cramped, meals repetitive, and reheated rice was common. And if you've ever reheated old rice in a weak microwave, you already know how dense and sticky it can get. And that detail will matter in this case. When cooked rice sits overnight in a refrigerator, it can harden into compact clumps if reheated unevenly. Mixed with fatty grilled pork, the texture becomes heavy and sticky, especially when eaten quickly while tired. That night, 2 employees called out sick during Niran's shift, which meant an additional load for him. At around 11:40 p.m., Niran was already exhausted. He clocked out shortly after midnight, carrying leftover pork skewers and a plastic container of refrigerated rice from his apartment. The apartment itself stayed humid from earlier rainstorms, and the kitchen ventilation barely worked. Investigators later found evidence that the meal had been reheated unevenly in a small microwave. Some rice softened while other sections stayed compacted together with pork grease. Half the food remained untouched beside the sink, suggesting he had been eating quickly before bed, probably just trying to finish dinner and finally get some sleep. Phone records later showed videos still playing on Niran's phone while he ate at the kitchen counter. Sometime after 12:30 a.m., he swallowed a large mouthful without fully chewing it. Investigators believe the compacted rice and pork entered the airway instead of the esophagus, blocking airflow almost immediately. Complete choking often becomes silent within seconds once the airway fully seals. That's the part many people don't realize until it happens. Based on damage inside the apartment, investigators believed Niran first tried coughing before realizing he could no longer breathe. A neighbor later reported hearing a loud bang against the wall around 12:35 a.m., followed by scraping noises. Bruising along his abdomen and marks on the counter suggested he attempted a self-Heimlich maneuver by driving his stomach against the edge repeatedly, which means he understood exactly what was happening. The obstruction never moved. Investigators believe he lost oxygen quickly and stumbled backward beside the refrigerator before collapsing face first onto the floor. His phone was later found beneath one arm, still playing videos. No emergency call was made because nobody nearby understood what had happened. In apartment buildings like that, Random noises through thin walls were common. At 7:12 the next morning, Niran's roommate returned from an early delivery shift and found him unresponsive beside the kitchen counter. Emergency responders arrived roughly 12 minutes later, but rigor mortis had already started. The autopsy found a tightly compacted mass of rice, pork fibers, and grease, completely blocking the upper airway. The medical examiner ruled the death mechanical asphyxia, caused by complete airway obstruction during eating. Police later closed the case as an accidental choking death, after the physical evidence matched the reconstruction inside the apartment. His landlord later told investigators that unpaid tuition notices and unopened class materials were still spread across the table beside the kitchen. Honestly, that detail probably explained his life better than anything else in the report. It was May 6, 2017. During a festival in Guadalajara, the main square filled early with music, games, and rows of food stalls. Large cooking stations served hundreds as smoke and steam mixed with the smell of grilled meat, spices, and hot oil. Everything felt busy but controlled. Rafael Ortega, 42, was managing one of the busiest food stations that day. He had years of experience working festival events and was used to long hours, heavy workloads, and large cooking setups. In front of him sat an industrial steel cauldron, approximately 40 gallons in capacity, filled with spicy stew, chilies, meat, and oil, held at a sustained rolling simmer between 200 to 212 degrees Fahrenheit since morning to meet demand. From the outside, everything looked routine. People passed by, some watching, others lining up. By mid-afternoon, the stew had thickened, moving slower each time it was stirred. The surface held its shape longer than before. Earlier, a metal lid had been placed loosely on top to speed up cooking. It stayed there for hours, slightly off-center but covering most of the opening. The lid shifted now and then, giving off a faint rattle that blended into the noise of the festival. Conversations continued, music played, and orders were called out. Up close, the surface stayed mostly still between stirs. The lid lifted slightly at times, releasing short bursts of steam before settling again. At around 3:18 in the afternoon, Rafael stepped closer to check the consistency of the stew. He reached for the lid and lifted one side, just enough to look inside. The moment the lid moved, everything changed. The partial release of trapped steam disrupted the surface stability of the superheated pockets below. The built-up heat and steam released rapidly. Instead of a single explosion, the reaction occurred as a violent boil-over, with superheated steam and boiling stew surging upward in a sudden, forceful eruption. The lid was thrown aside, and the thick mixture sprayed outward in every direction. What had been contained inside the pot for hours suddenly had nowhere to go but out. Rafael stood closest, about 1 to 2 feet from the cauldron. He took the full impact as steam and boiling liquid erupted outward. The mix of steam and oil caused immediate third-degree burns to his face, chest, and arms. A second worker was hit across the upper body and face, suffering severe burns and inhalation injury. Others nearby were struck by splashes. The reaction lasted seconds, but the damage was immediate. The burner was shut off as people pulled back. Some collapsed near the station, while others stumbled away, trying to remove the hot mixture. Oil clung to clothing and skin, prolonging the burns. Responders arrived within minutes. Rafael was unresponsive with extensive burns and no pulse. The second worker was in critical condition with breathing difficulty. Both later died, Rafael at the scene, the second at the hospital, while others were treated on site. The investigation identified a pressure-driven boilover caused by thick stew trapping steam under a partially covered lid. When lifted, it destabilized the surface and released the trapped heat rapidly. It was March 17, 2016. The small apartment in San Diego's North Park neighborhood was quiet, as Caleb Ritz carefully unrolled the package he'd purchased from a dockside fishmonger earlier that day. Inside was a 3-pound bullseye pufferfish, its spiny body still intact. What should have been a culinary adventure would become one of the most preventable deaths in San Diego County that year. Caleb was a 34-year-old freelance software contractor who lived alone and spent most of his income on food experiences. After a 2-week trip to Tokyo the previous fall, several friends said that he'd become obsessed with Japanese cuisine, particularly the prestige and danger surrounding fugu preparation. Fugu is the Japanese delicacy made from pufferfish, which contains tetrodotoxin in its organs and skin, a neurotoxin considered among the most potent known and requiring chefs to undergo years of training and licensing before they're permitted to serve it commercially. Caleb's apartment walls were covered with photos from Tokyo's Tsukiji fish market. His browser history showed months of research into authentic Japanese cooking techniques, but no formal training whatsoever. That morning, Caleb had driven to a commercial fishing dock where an unlicensed vendor sold him the puffer fish for $60 under the table, with no receipt, no labeling, and no questions asked. The vendor offered no preparation advice and likely hurried the transaction to avoid attention. Caleb returned home and queued up a 14-minute YouTube tutorial video on how to clean the puffer fish. By around 6:30 in the evening, Caleb was 2 hours into preparation. He followed the online tutorial and attempted to remove the toxin-bearing portions himself, unaware that even trace contamination during the process could be fatal. Investigators would later conclude that cross-contamination occurred during handling, leaving lethal toxin on the flesh. He plated 3 pieces of sashimi, admired them for a photo, saved the image to his laptop, and began eating approximately 7 in the evening. At 7:37 in the evening, Caleb texted his friend, "Lips feel weird." His friend responded asking if he was okay, then tried calling when no reply came. By that time, the numbness was spreading rapidly from Caleb's mouth down through his neck and chest. Minutes later, he likely tried to stand, but his legs gave out. He collapsed onto his kitchen floor, laptop still open on the counter showing the paused tutorial video. Tetrodotoxin works by blocking sodium channels in nerve cells, paralyzing voluntary muscles while leaving the victim completely conscious. Caleb lay on the tile floor, unable to move, unable to scream, his eyes open and aware. His diaphragm stopped contracting, his lungs ceased drawing air. His heart continued beating for several minutes as his brain began dying from oxygen starvation. The paralysis was total and silent. His friend became concerned after repeated texts and calls went unanswered. He called 911 at 9:15 in the evening and requested a non-emergency welfare check. Police arrived at 9:40 in the evening and found Caleb still warm to the touch on the kitchen floor. The autopsy later attributed the death to respiratory paralysis caused by tetrodotoxin poisoning, and subsequent toxicology testing confirmed lethal levels of the toxin in tissue samples. Stomach contents revealed toxin-contaminated pufferfish tissue, and a sealed disposal bag recovered from the kitchen was tagged and submitted as evidence. The YouTube video was eventually removed following a platform review tied to the investigation. Digital forensics showed the sashimi photo's embedded timestamp, matched browser history and message logs, establishing the sequence of events. Caleb's funeral drew colleagues and online friends. It was the 21st of May, 2017 in northern Italy. A soft, warm Sunday afternoon settled over a lakeside villa near Lake Como, the air mildly humid after a week of early summer heat. A private family lunch was being prepared, marking an otherwise uneventful weekend. Marco Bellini, 61 years old, was the founder of a major packaging machinery company in Turin. He lived with type 2 diabetes and fatty liver disease, both medically managed but still relevant risk factors for severe infection. Several months earlier, Marco had attended a private corporate meeting hosted by a foreign client. The event included a curated seafood course where he encountered raw oysters for the first time. He was unexpectedly impressed by the texture and flavor, describing them afterward as clean and refined. Unlike other guests, Marco became particularly fixated on the dish. Before leaving the event, he specifically requested the host for the contact details of the specialty seafood supplier responsible for the oysters. Within weeks, he began ordering premium oysters for personal use, reserving them for special occasions at home. That weekend, Marco arranged a seafood Sunday brunch at his residence following a successful week of merger negotiations. Wanting to recreate the experience from the private meeting, he contacted the same supplier and requested a midday delivery of raw oysters. The supplier warned that delivering over the weekend and keeping the food cold would be hard, but Marco pushed ahead and demanded the order arrive by Sunday midday. The oysters came from a licensed coastal farm and were transported inland through a refrigerated route, but a documented temperature handling delay occurred during the final distribution stage. The oysters arrived shortly before noon. Marco enthusiastically presented the oysters as the centerpiece of the meal, describing them as a delicacy. His wife was unconvinced. Their teenage son and daughter disliked the idea of eating uncooked shellfish and requested alternative dishes from the kitchen instead. Marco laughed at their reluctance and consumed the oysters himself. His wife was unconvinced. His children refused. Marco laughed and ate them alone. I really wish he knew that it was their instincts saving them. By mid-afternoon, Marco developed abdominal discomfort, nausea, and unusual fatigue. He initially attributed it to dietary indulgence and stress. Within a few hours, symptoms intensified rapidly: watery diarrhea, fever, and escalating weakness. By early evening, he was getting much worse. He had a fever, his mind was foggy, and he could barely stand without losing his balance. Emergency medical services were called. Paramedics found Marco with dangerously low blood pressure, a racing heart, and signs of severe infection. He was rushed to hospital in critical condition. Tests confirmed Vibrio vulnificus, a bacterium found in raw shellfish. In healthy people, it causes little harm, but in those with diabetes or liver disease, it can be deadly. Marco had no chance. Within hours, his body went into septic shock. His organs failed one by one. He was gone less than 15 hours after that noon delivery. Investigators traced the oysters to a broken cold chain during rushed weekend transport. No charges were filed. Marco left behind a wife and 2 children. Marco insisted on the delivery over the supplier's objection, and the cold chain failed exactly where the warning said it might. The next story moves to Rio de Janeiro on New Year's Day, where a man attended a private dinner, but holiday crowds on Copacabana Beach delayed the response that might have saved him. It was February 9th, 2018, Seattle, Washington. A residential kitchen in a quiet neighborhood on the north side of the city. The house sat back from the street behind a narrow front yard. No guests were expected. No one else was home. The evening had no reason to be different from any other. David Lang was 36. He worked as a delivery driver for a local courier company during the week. Outside of work, he spent most of his time cooking. He had taught himself dishes from many different cuisines over the years, and had built a solid reputation among people who knew him as someone who took food seriously. He followed recipes precisely, practiced techniques repeatedly, and took pride in getting details right. Friends trusted him with meals that required patience and control. Fugu was the next thing he wanted to try, and he approached it with the same mindset he had applied to everything else. Fugu is a puffer fish. In Japan, its preparation requires a formal license because the fish contains tetrodotoxin, a poison concentrated in the liver, ovaries, and skin. The fish had not been commercially processed, allowing the toxic organs to remain intact. David spent several weeks getting ready. He watched preparation videos online and practiced his knife skills on other fish before attempting the real thing. He studied diagrams, slowed footage down frame by frame, and tried to memorize each cut. At some point during his preparation, he reached out to a licensed fugu chef working in the Pacific Northwest. The chef told him not to do it. He explained that videos do not capture the full process, that subtle differences in anatomy matter, and that the toxin is unevenly distributed inside the fish. Without proper training, he said, there is no reliable way to confirm the preparation is safe. David listened, asked questions, and acknowledged the risks. Then he decided to proceed anyway. He prepared the fish alone in his kitchen and ate it by himself at the table. There were no observers and no one else involved in the preparation. What happened between the final cuts in the meal could not be independently verified afterward. Within minutes, his lips and tongue began to tingle. He recognized it immediately. The tingling is a known early sign of tetrodotoxin exposure, and his research had covered it. Over the next several minutes, the numbness spread into his face and down into his limbs. His coordination began to decline. Fine motor control went first, followed by increasing weakness. He remained conscious as his ability to move and breathe deteriorated, fully aware of the progression as it unfolded. He called emergency services and told them what he had eaten, his voice beginning to thicken as the numbness spread. Paramedics were dispatched immediately. There is no antidote for tetrodotoxin. The only treatment is supportive care, maintaining the airway and assisting breathing until the toxin clears the body. Whether that works depends on how much toxin entered the system and how quickly support is established. The exact amount David ingested could not be determined. The paralysis continued to advance after he made the call. By the time paramedics arrived, approximately 8 minutes later, his breathing was significantly impaired and deteriorating rapidly. He was intubated on scene and transported while resuscitation efforts continued. Despite assisted ventilation and continued emergency care, his condition did not stabilize. He was pronounced deceased at the hospital. The cause of death was respiratory failure, consistent with tetrodotoxin poisoning. Toxicology findings confirmed the presence of the toxin in his system. Investigators confirmed the fugu preparation had been done without proper training and without a license. The prior warning from the licensed chef was documented. The chef declined to comment further after the incident.
It was December 15th, 2018, in the small community of Santa Cruz in Batangas, Philippines. The covered basketball court was packed before sunset. Christmas lights hung from the rafters above stacks of raffle prizes, while music blasted from rented speakers. Under the flashing lights was 19-year-old Renzo Ren Evangelista, hanging out near the covered court with his cousins. His dad worked construction in Qatar, and his mom was a caregiver in Hong Kong, so Ren was raised by his grandmother. His parents were present mostly through video calls and monthly remittances. Ren was a quiet, low-key guy who worked odd jobs around the neighborhood. Everyone knew him as a polite kid who would do a favor for anyone, but his grandma knew one specific thing. Ren was an incredibly slow eater because large bites made him gag. That detail is honestly so terrifying considering what happened next. That year, the community Christmas party featured a relay race where participants could win grocery packs. I know how fiercely competitive people get over these free groceries. Contestants had to sprint to a table, stuff a whole hard-boiled egg into their mouth, swallow it, and tag the next player. It seemed cheap and harmless. There wasn't a medic on site, just local volunteers. Ren joined at the last second because a team was short a player. By his turn, his group was losing. I can picture him getting caught up in the pressure as he picked up the egg, mashed it with his fingers, and tried to swallow it fast. This is where everything went completely wrong. Instead of chewing, he tried swallowing the large mouthful immediately. The egg broke apart, but several large pieces compressed together into a dense food bolus at the back of his throat. Rather than moving down into his esophagus, the mass shifted over the entrance to his airway and became tightly lodged. For a few seconds, everyone kept laughing because the court was chaotic and loud, but Ren stood frozen, locking both hands around his neck as his face turned dark. His grandma noticed first. I can't even imagine the terror she felt realizing he wasn't playing around. By the time a volunteer pulled him away, nearly 40 seconds had passed. Ren dropped to his knees, fighting for air. A volunteer attempted the Heimlich maneuver. Each push forced out saliva, but the main piece stayed wedged tight. It's a surreal, heartbreaking scene to watch on the footage. The crowd going dead silent while upbeat Christmas music kept blasting. A neighbor pulled his van right up to the court. Tragically, Ren went limp before they could load him into the van. Because the community didn't have an ambulance, emergency responders met them halfway down the road. The hospital was 15 minutes away, but Ren was pronounced dead upon arrival. The medical report listed the cause of death as asphyxia from a food bolus. The egg blocked his windpipe. Investigators noted that the compressed mass of egg created a tight blockage over the windpipe. Even though some fragments broke loose during rescue attempts, the remaining obstruction continued, preventing enough air from reaching the lungs. Following the incident, local officials reviewed safety procedures for future community events, but no criminal charges were filed. What stays with me is that at the wake, neighbors pooled money for the coffin because Ren's parents couldn't make it back in time. Ren's grandmother would carry the weight of that Christmas party forever. But on the other side of the region, a different family was about to receive a phone call no one ever wants.
It was November 22nd, 2014, in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Warm air drifted through open apartment windows while football fans crowded around a television with beer bottles stacked across the counters. Fried food smoke hung over the kitchen as guests passed trays through the packed living room during the game. The owner of the apartment was Tyler Mendez, 32. He had just finished a long overnight delivery shift earlier that morning. He transported medical supplies between clinics across southern Louisiana and spent most nights alone on highways drinking gas station coffee to stay awake. Friends described him as funny, reckless, and always willing to do something stupid once people started recording with their phones. Over the years, Tyler built a reputation for food dares that kept escalating because nothing bad ever happened before. He swallowed spoonfuls of hot sauce, chewed ghost peppers for cash, and once drank expired barbecue sauce after somebody offered him $50. Most people laughed it off at the time, That's usually how these things keep getting worse. During the second half of the game, somebody dumped a bucket of fried chicken onto the kitchen counter and joked that Tyler should eat the bones too. At first, it sounded like the kind of stupid dare people throw around at loud parties without thinking twice about it. Tyler grabbed a wing, bit through the smaller bones and swallowed while people shouted and recorded from across the room. Every loud crunch got another reaction out of the crowd, and I could tell he was loving the attention because after a few wings, Tyler started eating drumsticks and thigh pieces with much thicker bones. Witnesses later told investigators he kept coughing between bites and washing everything down with beer. Videos recovered afterward showed him stopping several times with watery eyes while rubbing the front of his throat before forcing himself to continue. Looking back later, several friends admitted that it was probably the moment the whole thing should have stopped. Around midnight, Tyler suddenly pushed past the crowd and leaned over the kitchen sink. Witnesses saw him vomit partially digested food mixed with saliva and thin streaks of blood. Several people told him to go to the hospital because sharp bones could tear the stomach or intestines. But once alcohol and embarrassment get mixed, people ignore things they normally wouldn't. Tyler stayed another hour before finally leaving alone. Security footage from his apartment complex later showed him walking slowly from his truck while holding his stomach. By then, he clearly knew something felt wrong. Texts recovered later from his phone showed him complaining that his stomach felt swollen and painful. Medical investigators later determined that one sharp chicken bone likely pierced part of his lower intestine sometime during the night. The puncture itself was small, which is part of what made it so dangerous. Bacteria from inside the digestive tract slowly leaked into the abdomen and spread through his body. By late morning, the infection had become severe. Tissue around Tyler's organs became inflamed as bacteria entered his bloodstream. Investigators believe he collapsed while trying to get out of bed sometime before noon, and by that point, the infection was already spreading faster than he probably realized. At 1:47 p.m., co-worker Brandon Ellis drove to Tyler's apartment after he missed an important delivery route and stopped answering calls. Brandon found Tyler unconscious beside the bed and immediately called 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes and documented shallow breathing, dangerously low blood pressure, and signs consistent with septic shock. Tyler was transported to a nearby hospital, but was pronounced dead shortly afterward. Doctors later recovered multiple chicken bone fragments from his digestive tract. One sharp piece, measuring slightly over an inch, had pierced the intestinal wall near the lower abdomen. According to the coroner's report, the puncture allowed bacteria to spread through the abdominal cavity and bloodstream, leading to rapid organ failure. Police later reviewed cell phone footage from the party to establish the timeline. Several videos showed Tyler visibly struggling to swallow larger bone fragments, while people around him continued encouraging the challenge. And what's looked funny during the game ended up becoming evidence in the investigation. It was January 12, 2017, in a rented hillside home outside Gangneung. The property had been vacant for months between bookings, sealed through the winter with little ventilation. From the outside, it looked clean and ready, nothing suggesting anything had been left behind inside. One of the guests arriving that afternoon was Samuel Park, 20, a university student and freelance graphic designer. The trip had been planned casually with a small group of friends, just a few days away to rest. People who knew Samuel described him as careful and observant, someone who paid attention to details and rarely acted without thinking. After arriving, the group moved through the house slowly, unpacking and settling in. The windows were closed, and the kitchen felt warm and still, with no airflow or exhaust running. The air inside was stale, like it had been sealed for a long time, but nothing stood out as immediately wrong. While organizing food, Samuel opened a lower door near the back wall. It led to a small storage room, partially below ground level. The space was narrow, with concrete walls and no visible ventilation. Inside were several large plastic containers stacked along the floor, older fermentation batches left behind by the previous occupant. Most were labeled, though the writing had faded. Several contained kimchi, stored in bulk containers commonly used for long-term fermentation. Some lids were sealed tightly, while others showed minor warping from internal gas buildup. The room carried a strong fermented odor, sharper than what would normally be noticed in an open kitchen. Samuel stepped inside to inspect the containers more closely. He lifted the lid of one near the front. A brief release of gas followed, noticeable but not forceful. He set it aside and moved deeper into the room, closer to the back where more containers were stacked. Within that enclosed space, carbon dioxide had been slowly accumulating over time. The fermentation process inside multiple sealed containers had continued, releasing gas that settled in the lower part of the room. With no airflow to disperse it, the concentration near floor level had gradually increased. As Samuel crouched to check another container, his head moved into that lower layer. His movement slowed first. He shifted his weight slightly, one hand pressing against the container to steady himself. His breathing became shallow. He tried to stand, but didn't fully straighten before losing balance. He collapsed forward onto the floor of the storage room. The sound carried into the kitchen. A friend nearby entered and found him down inside the storage space. From the doorway, nothing looked disturbed. No broken objects, no signs of impact. Assuming he had fainted, the friend stepped in and bent down to lift him. As he moved lower, his breathing changed. He paused mid-movement, his posture slackening. He tried to adjust his footing but lost strength in his legs and dropped beside Samuel. Another friend followed shortly after. Seeing both of them on the floor, he moved in quickly. He reached down, pulling at one of their arms, but as he lowered himself into the same confined space, his coordination declined. He slowed, then stopped moving with control before collapsing near the entrance. By the time a fourth person arrived, 3 were already down inside the storage room. She stepped toward the doorway but hesitated, noticing something off in how still the space felt. Instead of entering fully, she pulled back and called out for help. A 5th friend approached but stayed outside the room. From where he stood, there were no clear signs of what had happened, just multiple people on the floor, unresponsive. He did not enter and called emergency services immediately. Responders arrived and identified the storage room as a confined space hazard. They ventilated the area before entry and used breathing equipment to extract the victims. Samuel and 2 others were unresponsive. One had a weak pulse and irregular breathing. The rest were outside the exposure zone. All were transported to the hospital. Samuel and 2 others died shortly after. The 4th remained in critical condition under respiratory support. The cause was traced to accumulated carbon dioxide from multiple fermentation containers stored in an unventilated below-ground room. Over time, the gas displaced oxygen in the lower part of the space, creating a low-oxygen environment. The case was ruled fatal carbon dioxide exposure due to confined space conditions. Afterward, the property was cleared of all stored fermentation materials, and ventilation systems were added. The containers themselves showed no external warning signs. The risk came from the enclosed space and the gradual buildup of gas that could not disperse. It was June 17, 2017. The evening air in Amarillo, Texas was hot and heavy, carrying the smell of grilled meat from a backyard party on the city's south side. What started as a typical Saturday night gathering would end with paramedics desperately working over a lifeless body on sun-scorched grass. Evan Jesus Moraes was 22 years old. He'd dropped out of the local community college after 1 semester, bouncing between delivery jobs and long stretches of unemployment. Friends described him as the guy who would do anything for attention and quick cash. That confidence and desperation, combined with a complete lack of self-preservation, made him a fixture at parties where bored young people gathered to watch someone humiliate themselves for entertainment. Friends said that Evan had earned maybe $200 total from these stunts over the past year, collected from spectators. Speed eating challenges were his specialty. He ate fast, chewed minimally, and relied on alcohol to wash everything down. That evening, someone offered $50 if Evan could finish 3 massive carne asada burritos in under 5 minutes. Each burrito weighed roughly 2 pounds, stuffed with dense beef, rice, beans, and thick flour tortillas. The party host had ordered them from a local Tex-Mex restaurant known for oversized portions. Evan had been drinking heavily since mid-afternoon, his judgment already impaired. Several people warned him the burritos looked dry and difficult to swallow quickly. Evan dismissed them, grabbing the first burrito and tearing into it while someone started a phone timer. He attacked the food with aggressive bites, barely chewing, washing massive mouthfuls down with gulps of beer. His cheeks bulged grotesquely as he forced more food in before swallowing completely. The crowd laughed and filmed, shouting encouragement. Evan gagged twice during the first burrito but powered through. By the second burrito, his pace had slowed noticeably. He was sweating, his face flushed red from exertion and alcohol. Friends later admitted they noticed him struggling but assumed he would stop if it became dangerous. Several people laughed initially, thinking it was part of the performance. Evan stumbled forward and collapsed face first onto the grass, his body rigid. Within seconds, he lost consciousness. As critical seconds ticked by with no air moving, his skin and lips turned cyanotic. Nearly half a minute passed before anyone realized this wasn't a joke. Someone finally moved to help, rolling him over. Evan's eyes were wide and terrified, his mouth open but unable to draw air. After more than a minute of complete oxygen deprivation, his body began to convulse as hypoxia overwhelmed his brain. A partygoer attempted the Heimlich maneuver, but executed it incorrectly, placing force across Evan's ribs instead of performing abdominal thrusts to the diaphragm. Nothing dislodged. As the obstruction remained and oxygen loss continued, Evan's convulsions gradually weakened, then stopped entirely. His eyes remained open but unfocused. Someone called 911 roughly 90 seconds after the obstruction began, long after the narrow window where intervention might have reversed the damage. Paramedics arrived minutes later, finding Evan unresponsive with no pulse. They immediately attempted to clear his airway, removing a densely compacted food bolus of partially chewed tortilla and meat lodged at the upper airway above the trachea. Advanced life support was initiated, but Evan never regained consciousness. The autopsy revealed traumatic impaction and severe soft tissue injury to the pharyngeal and laryngeal structures, along with petechial hemorrhages and cerebral edema from prolonged oxygen deprivation. His blood alcohol content was measured at 0.18%. The cell phone videos were quietly deleted within hours at the family's request. The $50 bet money was left anonymously on his mother's front porch 2 days later. No one from the party attended Evan's funeral. It was on the 23rd of June, 2017 in Tokyo, Japan. In a luxury penthouse suite in a high-rise serviced apartment building, a corporate dinner was held, and nobody suspected any problems. Lars Matthew Eriksson was 54 years old, a Norwegian banking executive who had lived in Japan long enough to understand its culture, its customs, and its corporate rituals. And on this particular evening, he sat among senior partners at a celebratory dinner, marking the completion of a major regional banking acquisition, a meal prepared in the kaiseki tradition, with licensed fugu as its centerpiece. The chef working that evening was certified and experienced, and his protocol was sound. Organs removed first and isolated, tools segregated, edible muscle sliced and plated only after the separation was complete. But the dinner was running behind schedule, and Lars was more focused on timing. The presentation had concluded successfully, and he wanted the dinner to proceed without delay. As guests settled, he requested that his portion of fugu be served first. The chef explained that preparation of fugu required a strict sequence of steps and complete separation between the tools used to handle toxic organs and the tools used to slice edible flesh. Because in fugu preparation, sequencing is not a preference. It is the entire safety system, Lars insisted, pressuring the chef to have his own portion immediately. The chef agreed, reluctantly, and a junior assistant was assigned to prepare a separate early serving for Lars before the remaining platters were assembled for the rest of the guests. In that compressed window, a slicing knife still active in the workflow, one that had passed near the liver-adjacent abdominal cavity during organ removal, was used to cut the final edible slices before the sterilization cycle was complete. Microscopic tetrodotoxin residue transferred from the blade to Lars's portion without any visible sign of contamination. The remaining servings were prepared later using properly sanitized equipment. The chef knew the protocol existed for a reason. He agreed to the request anyway, under the kind of social and professional pressure that is very difficult to refuse at a table full of senior banking executives. I do not think Lars understood what he was asking for when he asked for his plate first. Lars ate his portion, and the evening continued. 25 minutes later, he felt a tingling sensation around his mouth, mild at first, then spreading to his fingers. Within the hour, his muscles had weakened, his speech had slurred, and he could no longer stand. By the time emergency services arrived, the paralysis had reached his respiratory system. Despite ventilation and intensive medical intervention, Lars Matthew Eriksson died later that same night. Investigators determined that the contamination was limited entirely to the separately prepared portions served to Lars. The remaining executives who attended the dinner reported no symptoms and required no medical treatment. The toxic exposure was traced to a single knife reused before the sterilization cycle had been completed. Authorities concluded that the restaurant had used properly sourced fugu and employed a certified chef, but that a deviation from the normal preparation sequence had allowed contamination to occur. Fugu's service was suspended during the investigation, and the chef was formally questioned before authorities determined there was no evidence of intentional misconduct. Investigators ultimately concluded that a single deviation from the established preparation sequence had allowed the contamination to reach Lars's plate. And when I think about it, if Lars hadn't pushed the chef for an early serving and the chef hadn't agreed, nobody would have died that night. Lars died because a protocol built around strict sequencing was asked to bend once. It was March 3rd, 2016, Des Moines, Iowa. A residential home on a quiet street on the west side of the city. The neighborhood was the kind where nothing much happened on a weeknight. A standard dinner for 4 people was being prepared in a standard home kitchen. Nothing about the evening suggested anything other than routine. Margaret Ellis was 52. She worked part-time at a grocery store on the west side of Des Moines, stocking shelves and covering the occasional checkout shift. She handled most of the cooking in the household. She was not careless in the kitchen and was not unfamiliar with food safety as a general matter. At some point prior to March 3rd, she had come across an article explaining solanine, the toxic glycoalkaloid that develops in potatoes exposed to light. The article had been specific enough that she had saved it. It explained that solanine develops with light exposure, that it is not limited to visibly green areas of the potato, and that removing the discolored portions does not eliminate the toxin from the flesh. She had previously discarded potatoes on at least one occasion because of visible greening. On the evening of March 3rd, she found several potatoes in the household supply that showed visible green discoloration that extended beyond the surface layer. Several of the sprouts were long and well developed, where solanine concentrations are known to be highest. She removed the affected areas with a knife and proceeded with preparation. She did not discard the potatoes. The decision to cut away the green portions and continue was a correction she understood to be partial at best, and the article she had saved made clear that partial correction was not sufficient. She roasted the potatoes and served them as part of dinner for the 4 people in the household. Solanine does not behave like surface contamination. It is distributed through the flesh of the potato and is not broken down by cooking. Removing the visibly affected areas reduces the concentration slightly, but does not render the potato safe. The toxin that remained in the flesh after trimming survived the roasting process and was present in the finished dish. All 4 individuals ate the meal. Margaret took the majority of the roasted batch across the course of the evening, continuing to eat after the others had stopped. The others each consumed a modest portion. The concentration of solanine in the affected potatoes was not uniform, and the portions she consumed came from the most heavily affected areas. Later that night, the symptoms began. Gastrointestinal distress and nausea developed across all 4 individuals. The onset was initially attributed to routine foodborne illness, and no connection was made to the potatoes at that stage. The others remained unwell but stable. Margaret's condition moved beyond the gastrointestinal phase. She became dizzy and increasingly confused, and an unusual weakness developed that was inconsistent with ordinary food poisoning. Her condition continued to deteriorate. As her condition worsened, medical attention was sought. All 4 individuals were affected to varying degrees. The others survived with significant but non-fatal symptoms. Margaret Ellis did not recover. She died after her condition continued to deteriorate from acute solanine poisoning. Post-incident findings confirmed visible greening and sprouting in the potato supply used for the meal, with toxicology findings supporting solanine exposure consistent with ingestion. The bookmarked article was recovered from her device. Its content included an explicit warning that removal of green portions does not eliminate the risk. Her significantly higher intake was identified as the primary factor in the severity of her outcome relative to the others who had eaten the same meal.
It was July 8th, 2016, in Osaka, Japan. The cramped city neighborhood was packed with concrete apartment blocks and narrow streets. It was right before summer break, and the campus courtyard was crowded at lunch. In the middle of all that was 21-year-old Zenjiro Murata. Most people just called him Zen, and honestly, he sounded like a genuinely good kid. He was quiet, polite, and a total tech nerd who loved fixing up old radios with his granddad. Zen was just one of those guys who had to take everything apart to figure out how it ticked. He was part of his college robotics club, often staying up late to help build a sensor arm for an upcoming competition. But despite being smart, Zen had one stubborn habit. He loved frozen grape konjac jelly. His mom constantly warned him about the choking labels, but he never listened. Sometimes, no matter how old we get, we always think we're too smart to listen to our moms. That morning, he packed 2 frozen jelly cups in his bag. By lunch, they were still rock hard in the center. Security footage later showed him sitting outside with friends, talking about the robotics competition on what appeared to be a completely ordinary day. But around 12:37, Zen peeled the lid off one of the jellies. Instead of squeezing it out in small, manageable bites, he tilted the cup back and sucked it down hard. Witnesses said he was totally joking around, trying to swallow the whole thing in one shot, and that silly joke changed everything in a second. The jelly broke loose and slid straight into his throat, almost completely intact. At first, his friends thought he was joking. Then his hands shot to his throat. The frozen jelly had become lodged in his airway. He tried to cough, but only a faint clicking sound came out. Everyone could see something was terribly wrong, but nobody could fix it. A supervisor rushed over and started the Heimlich maneuver, while a nurse called 911, but the frozen jelly stayed firmly in place. By the time paramedics arrived 6 minutes later, Zen was already in severe distress and struggling to breathe. When Zen arrived at the hospital, doctors immediately focused on securing his airway. The challenge wasn't that they kept making unsuccessful attempts to grab the jelly. The real problem was that the frozen mass was tightly wedged in place and difficult to remove without causing further blockage. Every minute that passed meant less oxygen reaching his brain. Doctors eventually succeeded in removing the obstruction, but by then Zen had already experienced a prolonged period of oxygen deprivation. His heart went into cardiac arrest shortly afterward. Medical staff worked desperately to restore circulation and stabilize him. Although they were able to restart his heart, the lack of oxygen had caused catastrophic brain injury. Zen never regained consciousness. He died 2 days later, surrounded by his family. The autopsy confirmed the cause of death as complications from asphyxiation caused by airway obstruction. Investigators noted that freezing the jelly had likely contributed to the tragedy by making it firm enough to remain intact rather than breaking apart when it became lodged in his throat. In the aftermath, the campus banned frozen jelly cups entirely. It's an incredibly heavy story, but there is one small, bittersweet detail left to share. Zen's robotics club went ahead and finished building his sensor arm, entering it into the competition under his name. It was a quiet tribute to a bright guy who lost his life to something so ordinary. Half a world away from Zen's robotics workshop, another young man's story would also begin with something small, harmless, and impossible to take back.
It was March 11th, 2018, in downtown Portland. Cold rain had been falling most of the day, pushing crowds indoors by dinner time. Inside a packed sushi bar, wet shoes tracked water across narrow aisles while customers squeezed shoulder-to-shoulder filming, eating challenges from tightly packed tables. At the time, 30-year-old Eric Fox worked the front desk at a small gym in southeast Portland. On weekends, he filmed food and workout challenges with friends, and what started as harmless dares slowly turned into bigger stunts once the video started getting attention online. Eric also relied heavily on caffeine. Pre-workout powders, fat burners, and energy drinks had become part of his daily routine around the gym, so that time nobody there probably thought much about it anymore. Earlier that afternoon, Eric had already finished a workout and drank a large energy drink with about 300 milligrams of caffeine. He also had hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, a condition that thickens the heart muscle and can disrupt the heart's rhythm during stress, dehydration, or stimulant use. Friends later said he rarely talked about it, which honestly isn't unusual for younger adults living with manageable heart conditions. That night's challenge was simple: finish a massive sushi platter in under 40 minutes. Restaurant staff later said Eric started faster than almost anyone they'd seen. Right away, it looked more like a competition than dinner. Surveillance footage showed him barely slowing between bites, while friends filmed from across the table. Instead of water, he drank 2 more energy drinks during the challenge. That choice probably mattered more than the food itself. About 20 minutes in, customers noticed sweat soaking through his gray gym shirt, even though the restaurant felt cool. Witnesses later said Eric laughed about his heart pounding while continuing to eat. He also drowned most of the sushi in soy sauce, adding even more sodium on top of the caffeine and dehydration. Near the end of the platter, footage showed him slowing down and staring at the table longer between bites. One employee later noticed his hands shaking while grabbing another drink. Most people assumed he was just getting full. Nobody realized his heart was already struggling. Then Eric suddenly stopped chewing. He suddenly slammed both hands onto the table hard enough to rattle the plates. Witnesses said his expression changed almost instantly. When Eric stood up, he managed only one step before collapsing sideways into a nearby table, striking his face on the wooden edge before hitting the floor. Some customers initially thought he was choking because partially chewed rice and sushi fell from his mouth during the collapse. Honestly, it probably looked exactly like a choking emergency at first. A server called 911 at 8:41 p.m., while 2 off-duty nurses moved him onto his back. Witnesses described his breathing as uneven gasps with long pauses between them. Minutes later, his arms and legs began jerking violently. Paramedics arrived about 7 minutes later and confirmed there was no airway blockage. CPR continued on the restaurant floor for over 30 minutes, but Eric never regained consciousness. The autopsy later found severe thickening in the wall of his heart, consistent with hypertrophic cardiomyopathy. Investigators concluded heavy stimulant intake, dehydration, excess sodium, and physical stress triggered a fatal heart rhythm disturbance. The gym where Eric worked later partnered with a local heart foundation to encourage cardiac screenings for younger adults involved in intense fitness training and heavy stimulant use, because conditions like Eric's often stay hidden until something suddenly pushes the body too far. It was February 14, 2018, and a chocolate factory on the outskirts of Brock was running non-stop to meet Valentine's Day demand. The air smelled of warm chocolate as production lines moved continuously, pushing out batch after batch with little pause. Workers moved faster than usual, trying to keep up with orders that had to be finished on time. Ilara Favre, 30, worked in quality control near the main processing area. Her job was to check batches as they moved through heating and mixing, watching for anything that didn't meet standards. She was known for catching small issues others missed, but that day the pace left little room for slowing down. After hours on shift, she had already inspected dozens of batches, moving between stations as production continued without interruption. Behind the main line sat a large enclosed mixing tank used to liquefy chocolate in bulk. It handled large volumes, heating and holding chocolate before it moved further down the system. Cleaning and maintenance were routine, but only after full shutdown, cooling and ventilation. Those steps were strict for a reason, but they also took time, and time was limited that day. Earlier that morning, a minor issue had been reported near the lower valve of the tank. A small blockage had slowed part of the flow. It wasn't unusual during heavy production, and most cases were handled quickly without major concern. The line was placed into a short maintenance pause, and a cleaning-in-place cycle was started using an alkaline solution commonly used for food equipment. The system had been briefly adjusted before continuing operation, and from the outside, everything appeared normal. Records later showed the rinse cycle ended early, leaving residual chemical in the lower piping and valve assembly. Later in the process, a batch from that system reached the testing station. Ilara collected a sample, following routine procedure, and allowed it to cool briefly before testing, and tasted a small amount to check consistency and flavor. It was something she had done many times before, part of the job and usually safe under controlled conditions. Within seconds, something felt off. The taste was slightly bitter, not what she expected. At first, it didn't seem serious. The reaction came quickly. She immediately pulled away and spat out what remained, but a burning sensation had already spread across her mouth and throat. A burning sensation followed, then coughing and throat irritation as her breathing began to tighten. She stepped back from the station, trying to steady herself, but her balance gave way. A second worker nearby, who had also sampled the same batch, began showing similar signs. He slowed down, gripping the edge of the counter as his breathing became uneven. Another worker noticed both of them struggling and immediately called for help. The area was cleared as more workers who had tasted the sample started reporting symptoms. Some felt nausea and confusion, while others struggled to stay upright. Several complained of severe throat pain, vomiting, and difficulty swallowing. Even small amounts were enough to trigger a noticeable reaction. Emergency responders treated the workers on site before transporting the most severe cases. Ilara was struggling to breathe, her airway swelling and restricting airflow. Another worker was in critical condition. At the hospital, Ilara was pronounced dead after her condition deteriorated. The cause was consistent with severe airway compromise from chemical burns. Another worker later died from complications, while several others survived under monitoring. The investigation found that a cleaning chemical had not been fully flushed from the system, contaminating the chocolate as it passed through. Even small amounts were toxic when ingested. The case was officially recorded as a fatal food poisoning incident caused by accidental chemical contamination during production. It was not the recipe itself that caused harm, but what had been left behind inside the system. Afterward, the factory enforced stricter separation between cleaning procedures and active production. Full flushing and verification became mandatory before any system could be used again, and sampling procedures were adjusted to reduce direct exposure. It was September 18, 2014. Rural Nueva Ecija province in the Philippines stretched under gray monsoon skies. The rice paddies waterlogged from 2 weeks of flooding that had devastated harvests across the region. Rogelio Icatlo, a 41-year-old tenant farmer, stood knee-deep in muddy water outside his small concrete block home, knowing his family's food supply was running dangerously low. Rogelio had worked rice fields his entire adult life, renting 7 hectares from a landowner who took 60% of each harvest. The recent typhoon had destroyed most of his standing crop, leaving him with almost no income until the next planting season. His wife, Lena, 38, worked occasional laundry jobs, but money was scarce. Their 3 children, aged 6, 9, and 12, had been eating mostly rice porridge for days. Foraging supplemented their diet during lean times. Wild plants, snails, and field frogs were common protein sources for poor farming families throughout the province. Rogelio had caught frogs dozens of times before, usually the common brown paddy frogs that thrived in flooded fields. That afternoon, Rogelio decided to collect frogs to feed his family. The flooding had brought out numerous amphibians, and he spotted what appeared to be good-sized specimens near the irrigation ditch. What Rogelio didn't know was how to properly distinguish between edible paddy frogs and toxic Asian black-spined toads. The toads, when mud-covered and small, looked nearly identical to young frogs, especially to someone not trained in species identification. He spent an hour collecting 12 amphibians, dropping them into a plastic bucket. Several were actually toads, their distinctive spiny backs obscured by thick mud. Back home, Lena helped skin and clean them, a process that should have revealed the toad's different skin texture and parotoid glands, but neither parent recognized the danger. She seasoned them with salt and garlic, then fried everything in a shared pan, unaware that the heat would not destroy the toxin. The family ate together at 6 in the evening, the children excited to have meat with their rice. Within 40 minutes, catastrophe struck. The youngest child suddenly vomited violently across the table, then began drooling uncontrollably. Her small body went rigid, muscles seizing as bufatoxin spread rapidly through her system. Rogelio doubled over with crushing abdominal pain that felt like his stomach was tearing apart. Lena's heart began thumping in heavy, irregular patterns, pounding unevenly before she collapsed onto the concrete floor. The 9-year-old, still conscious but trembling, ran screaming to the neighbor's house. The neighbor immediately called the rural health station, but the nearest ambulance was 40 minutes away. Another neighbor helped load the family into his motorized tricycle, racing toward the town clinic about 9.5 miles away. In the cramped sidecar, Rogelio convulsed violently, white foam bubbling from his mouth as cardiac toxins disrupted his heart rhythm. The youngest child stopped breathing entirely before they reached the main highway. Lena's body jerked with irregular spasms, her heart misfiring with each contaminated beat. The local health examiner identified findings consistent with acute bufatoxin poisoning during the preliminary examination. Rogelio was pronounced dead shortly after arrival at the clinic from sudden cardiac arrhythmia. Lena Icatlo suffered repeated ventricular fibrillation and was declared dead less than 30 minutes later despite basic resuscitation attempts. Their 6-year-old daughter was pronounced dead on arrival, having stopped breathing during transport. Medical findings later confirmed fatal cardiac rhythm collapse and multi-organ failure in all 3 victims within 2 hours of ingestion. The 2 older children, aged 9 and 12, survived after emergency stabilization, but suffered permanent neurological damage from oxygen deprivation, including persistent tremors and documented short-term memory impairment. Both were discharged weeks later into the care of extended relatives. It was on the 14th of September, 2015, at a private vineyard estate in Napa Valley, California, where an invitation-only networking dinner brought together investors, developers, and senior executives from across the state. Sandra Forbes was 42 years old, a successful commercial real estate developer based in Sacramento. Over the previous decade, she had built a reputation turning overlooked properties into profitable developments and was always looking for the next opportunity to expand. The dinner was not open to the public. Attendance was limited to a select group of investors, developers, and executives, and the menu featured imported luxury ingredients, including a limited allocation of authentic Japanese Wagyu beef. Sandra had received an invitation and brought her longtime friend Melissa Drew as her guest. Melissa often joked that Sandra treated networking like a second full-time job. Even before dinner began, Sandra was already moving through the crowd, introducing herself to potential contacts and looking for opportunities. I find that detail telling rather than critical. Sandra had built a career by not wasting opportunities, and a room full of investors was not a place she was going to treat as purely social. During the early courses, Sandra noticed an investment executive across the terrace whose firm had financed projects similar to her own. A conversation with him could potentially open doors worth millions. As the evening continued, she eventually found an opportunity to introduce herself, and the two spent several minutes discussing current development projects and investment trends. When the Wagyu beef course was served, the conversation shifted briefly to the meal. The beef had been imported from Japan in limited quantities specifically for the event, and was accompanied by a small serving of premium caviar. Sandra seemed genuinely excited by it. Melissa later recalled Sandra mentioning that authentic Wagyu was still relatively rare in the United States, and explaining some of the details she had learned about its grading and production. The executive appeared interested, and Sandra continued talking while preparing another bite. Wanting to sample both together, she stacked several slices of Wagyu and added a spoonful of caviar on top. The mouthful was noticeably larger than the portions she had been taking earlier. I think this is the point where two different priorities collided. Sandra wanted to enjoy one of the most expensive dishes on the menu, but she also wanted to keep the attention of someone who might become an important business connection. As she continued describing the beef, she attempted to respond to a question before fully swallowing the bite. The interruption triggered an immediate cough. She paused, trying to recover discreetly, but the coughing persisted and quickly became more forceful. Within moments, it became clear she was struggling to clear her airway. Nearby guests initially assumed it was a temporary irritation, but her condition escalated rapidly. Melissa and others moved closer as Sandra attempted to breathe and could no longer form coherent speech. A guest with basic emergency training intervened, attempting abdominal thrusts, while another called emergency services. Estate staff arrived and assisted in continued efforts to clear the obstruction. The efforts produced no sustained improvement. Sandra lost consciousness, and emergency personnel continued resuscitation attempts during transport to the hospital, but she never regained a pulse. Sandra Mason Forbes was pronounced dead later that evening. The official cause of death was accidental airway obstruction resulting in hypoxic cardiac arrest, caused by a severe choking event during the meal. Melissa later provided statements to investigators, while the investment executive confirmed they had been speaking moments before the emergency began. The death was ruled accidental, and the vineyard reviewed its emergency response procedures following the incident. It was January 18, 2014, Phoenix, Arizona, a residential home on the west side of the city. Early morning before the sun had fully come up. The neighborhood was quiet at that hour. A paramedic was due at work and moving through his routine, with the kind of efficiency that comes from doing the same thing every day for years. Jason Miller was 44, He had worked as a paramedic for 14 years. He had managed choking emergencies in the field more times than he could count. He knew the mechanics of airway obstruction, knew what the body did when it could not get air, and knew how quickly the window for intervention closed. That knowledge was procedural and automatic, shaped by repetition and real-world exposure. It guided how he assessed other people in crisis, how he prioritized steps, and how he acted under pressure. It did not translate into the decisions he made about his own body on the morning of January 18th, where familiarity and routine overrode caution. He had been diagnosed with esophageal narrowing, a stricture that affected the normal mechanics of swallowing. The condition had been formally documented, and his physician had advised him specifically to avoid large, unchewed food items. A whole egg had been mentioned directly as the kind of food that posed a real risk, given the narrowing. The stricture reduced the effective diameter of the esophagus, making the passage of solid food less predictable. It also increased the chance that an item could stall higher in the swallowing pathway. He understood this in clinical terms, and had likely seen similar complications in patients. He also understood that he was running late and that breakfast needed to be quick. He had a hard-boiled egg. He swallowed it whole without chewing. It was a decision made in a compressed moment, part habit, part time pressure, and part confidence shaped by years of experience handling emergencies. He had spent 14 years helping other people through airway obstructions. That familiarity may have contributed to the assumption that if something went wrong, he would be able to correct it. The egg became lodged in his throat, blocking the airway completely. There was no partial passage of air around it. The obstruction was complete. In such cases, effective airflow stops immediately. Self-administered abdominal thrusts using a fixed object can sometimes dislodge an obstruction. However, that requires rapid positioning, coordination, and a brief window of functional movement. Those conditions were not sustained. Within seconds, the lack of oxygen began to affect brain function. Disorientation set in, followed by a rapid loss of control. He lost consciousness before any effective intervention could be completed. He collapsed in the kitchen without clearing the obstruction or reaching a phone or nearby support. The kitchen remained undisturbed. There were no signs of struggle beyond the immediate collapse. No one else was in the house, and there were no nearby observers to recognize that anything had gone wrong in real time. The event occurred entirely without interruption. Jason did not report for his scheduled shift that morning. His employer attempted to contact him multiple times. When those attempts failed, a welfare check was requested. Officers arrived at the residence and entered the home. He was found unresponsive on the kitchen floor. Emergency response confirmed there were no signs of life. Jason Miller was pronounced deceased at the scene. Post-incident findings confirmed a documented esophageal stricture, prior medical advice against consuming large unchewed food items, and an obstruction consistent with the ingestion of a whole hard-boiled egg. The cause of death was recorded as fatal airway obstruction, resulting from choking on a whole food item in the presence of impaired swallowing mechanics.
It was June 18th, 2016, over in Busan, South Korea. Even long after sunset, the harbor district was absolutely buzzing with fishing crews and sailors packing into tiny waterfront joints. The humid sea air was thick, tables were jammed, and the phones came out the second someone suggested eating something crazy. Sitting at one of those tables was 34-year-old Rios Santos, a Filipino ship mechanic who spent his days keeping massive cargo vessels running. His crewmates described him as dependable, careful, and the last person to seek trouble. Everything Rios did was for his family. Most of his paycheck went straight to his wife and young son back home, and he spent years saving to bring them to South Korea. And knowing how much he loved them makes this story even harder to hear. Friends said he never stopped talking about his family and used every chance he got to video call them whenever his ship reached port. That night, a bunch of the crew gathered at a local seafood spot right by the docks to celebrate finishing a really rough voyage. Now, one of the big items on the menu there was live baby octopus, which is a pretty well-known delicacy in South Korea, but definitely an acquired taste if you're not from there. They chop the pieces up small, but here's the creepy part, that the nerves stay active for a little bit, so the tentacles are still squirming around on the plate. The restaurant staff always tells people you have to chew it down completely before you even think about swallowing. Once the food hit the table, some of the younger guys immediately started filming videos for social media. At first, Rios wanted absolutely no part of it. He'd never eaten live octopus before and looked pretty uncomfortable with the whole idea. But as the table got louder, a few of his buddies started egging him on. Eventually, he gave in, probably just wanting to be a good sport and not look like a party pooper in front of the crew. Witnesses said Rios picked up a wriggling piece, dipped it in sesame oil, and put it into his mouth. Instead of chewing it thoroughly, he appeared to swallow almost immediately. A few coworkers laughed and cheered while the cameras kept recording. For a moment, nothing seemed wrong. Then Rios suddenly froze. Investigators later reviewed footage showing Rios suddenly grabbing his throat and slamming a fist onto the table. A mass of octopus tissue had become lodged in his airway, while the tentacles and suction cups made it difficult to remove. His face quickly turned red as he struggled to breathe. At first, co-workers thought he was reacting to the texture. Then panic set in. Rios knocked over his chair, stumbled backward, and went silent. A crewmate immediately performed the Heimlich maneuver, but the obstruction remained. Paramedics later restored his pulse, but the lack of oxygen caused severe brain damage. He died the next day. The autopsy confirmed choking from octopus tissue blocking his airway. Afterward, his crewmates raised money to help his wife and son with funeral expenses, while police reviewed the phone footage and ruled the death a tragic accident. The case sparked debate about the dangers of swallowing live octopus without chewing properly. Several restaurants reportedly removed similar eating challenges afterward. Rios never made it home to the family he worked so hard to support, but thousands of miles away in Japan, another ordinary contest was about to turn deadly for a retired delivery driver.
It was May 3, 2017, in Naga City. Heavy rain earlier that week had flooded drainage canals, leaving thick weeds and broadleaf plants growing beside muddy irrigation ditches. By evening, the air felt humid and still while roadside food stalls slowly closed before another storm moved across the city. For Paulo Rivera, cheap meals had become part of surviving life in Naga. The 26-year-old worked overnight customer support near Magsaysay Avenue and shared a cramped rental house with 3 other workers from different provinces. Most nights they cooked together to save money between shifts. Lying was one of the meals they made often because the ingredients were usually affordable. But several wild plants in the Philippines closely resemble gabi leaves, especially near flooded canals after heavy rain. Some contain calcium oxalate crystals that can severely irritate the mouth and throat if eaten. That afternoon, Paulo and 2 roommates spotted large, heart-shaped leaves growing beside an overgrown ditch near their rental house. None of them knew much about identifying crops, but one roommate insisted the leaves looked close enough to Gabby to skip buying ingredients at the market. And just like that, they stuffed the leaves into a grocery bag and carried them home. Around 6 p.m., they started cooking, while another roommate slept before work. Coconut milk simmered inside an old aluminum pot, while shrimp paste and chili peppers filled the kitchen with a salty smell. One roommate noticed the leaves stayed unusually firm during cooking and smelled sharper than normal laying, but nobody wanted to waste the ingredients after already spending money on the meal. The first bites immediately tasted wrong. Not spoiled exactly, just rough enough that everyone noticed it. The leaves felt bitter and scratchy, almost like tiny splinters scraping against the tongue. One roommate stopped eating after a few spoonfuls and kept rinsing his mouth at the sink. That was probably the first real sign something was seriously wrong. Paulo kept eating because he thought the burning sensation came from the chili peppers, which honestly makes sense if you've ever eaten really spicy laying. Within minutes, he started coughing hard, while thick saliva dripped onto the kitchen floor. His voice became strained as the inside of his throat started swelling. Witnesses later told investigators he kept swallowing repeatedly while gripping the table for support. One roommate used a phone flashlight to check his mouth and saw the tissue under his tongue turning bright red and swollen. The swelling spread quickly, and once the airway starts narrowing like that, panic usually makes breathing even harder. Paulo struggled to swallow water without choking. His breathing became louder and uneven as mucus collected in his throat. Another roommate searched symptoms online while trying to help him rinse his mouth, which is exactly what a lot of people do before realizing they're already dealing with a real emergency. At 7:18 p.m., one roommate finally called emergency services after Paulo collapsed beside the sink. Heavy rain and flooded streets delayed responders for more than 20 minutes. In parts of Naga during flood season, delays like that were not unusual. By the time paramedics arrived, Paolo was lying on the kitchen floor covered in saliva and mucus, while clawing at his neck and struggling to breathe through a severely narrowed airway. He lost consciousness while paramedics carried him downstairs to the ambulance. Doctors later found extensive swelling throughout his mouth, throat, and upper airway. The medical examiner concluded Paolo died from acute airway obstruction caused by calcium oxalate crystals from a toxic wild aroid plant mistakenly cooked as gabi leaves. Under a microscope, the crystals resembled tiny needles embedded throughout the damaged tissue. Investigators later placed the toxic plant beside real gabi leaves during interviews. Paolo's roommates said they could barely tell the difference, and honestly, that was probably the most disturbing part of the entire case. It was October 18, 2019, in Jamaica's Blue Mountains. Rain had just cleared, leaving the campsite damp and quiet beneath the trees. Students settled into their tents after a long hike with nothing out of place. By midnight, that calm had broken, one tent falling silent for reasons no one yet understood. Chloe Bennett, 20, was part of a university field group on an environmental study trip. She joined for both credit and the experience, known among her classmates as curious and willing to try new things. After several days of hiking through rural trails, the group had grown more comfortable moving through the area. That afternoon, while passing a cluster of trees, Chloe noticed several ackee fruits still closed on the branches and some scattered on the ground. With no clear understanding of how the fruit should be handled, she picked a few, assuming they could be opened and eaten later, treating them like other fruits they had come across during the trip. The fruits were firm and sealed, their outer skin not yet naturally split, an early stage where the inner flesh is not considered safe to eat. Back at the campsite that evening, the group settled in after dinner, relaxed and tired from the day. With no sense of urgency or concern, Chloe brought out the ackee she had collected. The fruits were still closed, but she cut them open herself and began passing around small portions to a few classmates, treating it like a simple snack. The seeds were removed, but the pale flesh remained dense and slightly rubbery, different from fully ripened ackee, though no one reacted to it at the time. Most only tasted small amounts before moving on. Chloe and two others ate more than the rest, finishing most of what had been collected. After a while, the moment passed, and everyone returned to their tents. The campsite grew quiet as the night settled in. Roughly 6 hours later, just after midnight, the first signs began to appear. One student woke up with sudden nausea that quickly turned into vomiting. In another tent, someone complained of stomach pain, followed by dizziness and weakness. Soon after, more students began waking up with similar symptoms. What started as 1 or 2 cases spread across the campsite, with multiple people experiencing severe stomach cramps and repeated vomiting. At first, it appeared to be food poisoning, but the progression didn't follow a typical pattern. Chloe's condition worsened faster than anyone else's. Her vomiting became frequent and forceful, leaving her struggling to catch her breath between episodes. She needed assistance to sit upright, her movement slowing as coordination began to decline. The two others who had eaten the most showed similar escalation, moving beyond stomach pain into visible weakness and instability. Chloe's vomiting suddenly slowed, then stopped. When classmates checked on her, her body began to convulse. Her muscles tightened, then released into irregular jerking movements. Her arms pulled inward while her legs moved unevenly against the ground. During one seizure, her jaw clenched and she bit her tongue, causing minor bleeding at the mouth. The convulsions came in bursts, decreasing in strength but becoming more irregular. Between episodes, her breathing became shallow and inconsistent, with brief pauses before each inhale. The two other students who had eaten the most were now in similar condition. One collapsed near his tent, unable to stand, his body going limp between episodes of muscle tightening. The other showed the same rapid decline, progressing from vomiting to loss of coordination soon after. Around them, at least 10 other students remained conscious but in distress, dealing with severe stomach pain, nausea, and repeated vomiting. The campsite, quiet moments earlier, shifted into confusion as people tried to help while managing their own symptoms. Emergency services were called, but the remote terrain delayed access. Coordinates were relayed through a satellite phone. By the time paramedics arrived, Chloe was unresponsive, and two others were in critical condition with irregular breathing. Treatment began on site before all were transported out. Chloe and the two who had eaten the most ackee died shortly after reaching the hospital. 10 others were admitted for monitoring. The cause was confirmed as hypoglycin A, poisoning from unripe ackee, leading to severe hypoglycemia and neurological failure. The case was classified as group poisoning, followed by stricter rules banning foraging during field trips. It was November 17, 2013. The kitchen of a modest farmhouse in Yakima, Washington, was filled with the ordinary sounds of Sunday dinner. Marissa Eriks, a 16-year-old junior at a local high school, sat with her family around a table laden with home-preserved vegetables her father had canned 6 months earlier. Marissa was the kind of teenager colleges competed for. She maintained a 4.0 GPA while juggling advanced placement courses, cross-country track, and volunteer work at a community food bank. Friends described her as driven but genuinely kind. Her father, Thomas, had spent the past decade embracing self-sufficiency principles, promoted by various survivalist networks and online preparedness communities. He believed strongly in food independence, converting their garage into a canning operation each summer and filling shelves with preserved vegetables, fruits, and meats. Thomas had learned canning techniques primarily from internet forums and amateur YouTube tutorials, rather than extension office guidelines. That summer, he had processed 47 quarts of green beans, using a standard water bath method instead of pressure canning. Unaware that boiling water reaches only 212 degrees Fahrenheit, while killing botulinum spores requires sustained temperatures of 240 degrees. Extension agents had offered free canning safety workshops throughout Yakima County that season, and printed materials specifically warned against water bath canning for low-acid vegetables. However, the sealed jars showed no bulging lids, no off odors, no visible mold, and he saw no reason for concern when he opened a jar that November evening. Marissa ate a full serving of the green beans at dinner around 6 in the evening. The beans likely tasted slightly off, but nothing alarming enough to stop eating. By noon the next day, she complained of double vision during lunch at school. Her speech began slurring during afternoon classes, prompting her chemistry teacher to send her to the nurse. Marissa insisted she just needed rest, and the school nurse, noting her calm demeanor, advised her to go home rather than call emergency services immediately. By 8 that evening, she could no longer hold her head upright. Thomas watched his daughter's condition deteriorate with growing horror. Her eyelids drooped heavily, unable to fully open. She struggled to swallow water. When she tried to speak, only garbled sounds emerged. Her limbs felt impossibly heavy, then stopped responding to her commands entirely. The paralysis crept methodically downward through her body, shutting down muscle function while leaving her mind completely alert and aware. Thomas delayed calling for help, assuming she would recover if he kept her comfortable, unaware that botulism antitoxin needed to be administered as soon as possible. By midnight, Marissa lay in bed fully conscious but unable to move or communicate. Her breathing became increasingly labored as her diaphragm muscles weakened. She could feel every desperate attempt to draw air becoming more difficult, her chest refusing to expand. Thomas finally called emergency services at 12:40 in the morning, 18 hours after dinner, when he realized she was suffocating. Paramedics arrived within 11 minutes and attempted to provide mechanical ventilation, while notifying the regional hospital to prepare antitoxin treatment. Despite resuscitation efforts, Marissa was pronounced dead at 2:15 in the morning. The autopsy revealed no physical injuries, no signs of trauma or disease. Clinical presentation strongly suggested botulism, and confirmatory laboratory testing for botulinum toxin on Marissa's serum and leftover green beans later returned positive. Death was attributed to respiratory failure caused by foodborne botulism from improperly canned vegetables. Thomas turned all 200 jars over to local health authorities for testing and proper disposal, rather than discarding them himself. The garage shelves remained empty, and the family never preserved food at home again. It was the 12th of April, 2014. In downtown Chicago, one of the city's most celebrated experimental restaurants in the upscale dining district was deep into its Saturday service, and a couple had left their home in Hinsdale for what was meant to be a rare night of celebration. William Lively was 38 years old, a self-made industrialist who owned a steel manufacturing company, a Midwestern structural steel supplier that had grown from a small fabrication shop into a major regional contractor. Success had brought wealth, but not time. His days were defined by production schedules, supply chain pressure, and expansion demands that rarely paused. For more than a decade, life had narrowed into work and recovery between work. Meals with Laura were often interrupted, conversations shortened by fatigue, and weekends frequently absorbed by emergencies at the plant. Their 10th wedding anniversary was an intentional break from that rhythm. William had cleared his schedule entirely and chosen a downtown Chicago restaurant known for modern, experimental fine dining. It was a place they had long intended to visit, but never prioritized. William had lived with a peanut allergy since childhood. It had been severe in his youth, but managed in adulthood through avoidance and caution. Before the dinner, he had reviewed the restaurant's menu and saw nothing that appeared to contain peanuts. He felt sure the food was safe, so he never mentioned his allergy to anyone, and no one at the restaurant thought to ask. For his main course, he ordered a slow-cooked beef dish with seasonal vegetables and a savory foam. Unknown to him, the kitchen had recently modified the foam using a peanut-derived stabilizing ingredient that had not yet been updated in service documentation or communicated clearly to front-of-house staff. The evening continued normally until minutes after eating. William initially felt only mild discomfort, then tightness in his throat, a discomfort that moved quickly and without mercy into something far worse. His airway narrowing, his breathing becoming labored, and Laura called for staff immediately. Paramedics administered epinephrine and initiated oxygen support, and transported him to hospital with urgency, where the medical team administered further doses and initiated full resuscitation protocols. But William had entered severe anaphylactic shock with rapid systemic collapse. He was pronounced dead later that night. The incident was classified as fatal anaphylaxis due to peanut exposure. A formal investigation identified a breakdown in internal coordination regarding the modified ingredient and insufficient verification of allergen risks. The Harper family filed a civil wrongful death lawsuit alleging negligence in allergen control and failure to disclose a high-risk ingredient. The restaurant denied recklessness, framing the incident as a systems failure rather than deliberate misconduct. Settlement discussions emerged before trial. I think about Laura, sitting across that table on their 10th anniversary, watching a systems failure take her husband, and I find I cannot make that framing feel adequate. Following the case, the restaurant implemented stricter allergen verification protocols, requiring formal checks for all modified dishes across both kitchen and service teams. For Laura, someone was blamed, but nothing truly felt settled. The anniversary that was supposed to be a celebration became the moment her world fell apart. William died because a modified ingredient and an unmentioned allergy produced a gap that neither side of the table could see. But somewhere else, a generous man spent an entire day in open heat supervising his estate's Eid celebrations before sitting down to a heavy meal, but could not finish it. It was June 5th, 2015. Austin, Texas. A Friday evening in the restaurant district, warm and busy, the kind of night the area was built for. The streets were full and the restaurants were loud in the way they always were on a Friday when the weather held. Noah Lee and Diane Brooks had already been to 2 restaurants before they settled into their 3rd. Noah Lee was 29. He worked as a software developer for a mid-sized tech firm in Austin. He had been with the company for 3 years, writing code for internal logistics software, the kind of work that kept him at a desk for most of the day and left him socially quieter than his age might have suggested. He had a severe peanut allergy that had been documented since he was a child. He knew exactly what it could do to him. 2 weeks before June 5th, he had already experienced a reaction from cross-contamination at a different restaurant, serious enough that he had needed medical attention. He carried an EpiPen everywhere he went. He understood the risk better than most people understood their own medical conditions. Diane Brooks was 27. She worked in marketing and had met Noah through a mutual colleague. This was their first date. Noah had been trying to get her to go out with him for several months. The evening had started well. They had moved through 2 other restaurants before settling into the 3rd, working through the kind of conversation that comes easier as the night progresses. By the time they were seated at the 3rd restaurant, Both of them were relaxed, and the dynamic between them had found its footing. He had not told her about the allergy at any point during the evening. He had not raised it at the first restaurant or the second. There were moments where it could have come up naturally, and he had let each one pass without saying anything. Diane ordered peanut sauté noodles. The dish came, and she was enjoying it. At some point during the meal, she offered him a bite directly. Noah knew exactly what was in it. He had seen the dish ordered, and he recognized what was on the fork. He took the bite anyway and told her the food was good. He did not mention the allergy. His EpiPen was not with him. He had left it in his car at the start of the evening. He made no move to excuse himself and retrieve it. He stayed at the table and kept the evening going as though nothing had changed. Within minutes, the symptoms started. His throat tightened. He recognized what was happening because he had felt it before. He excused himself from the table and walked to the restroom at the back of the restaurant without telling Diane anything was wrong. He gave no indication of the situation as he left. He was alone in the restroom with no medication and no one around him. The reaction escalated without anything to stop it, affecting his ability to breathe and circulate oxygen effectively. There was no one in the restroom to recognize what was happening or to call for help. Diane waited at the table. She assumed he would return. Several minutes passed before the absence felt long enough to raise with staff. She asked a member of staff to check on him. Noah Lee was found unresponsive on the restroom floor. Emergency services were contacted immediately. Despite intervention, his condition could not be reversed, and he was pronounced deceased at the scene. The cause of death was severe anaphylaxis following peanut exposure without epinephrine administration. His allergy history and the cross-contamination incident 2 weeks prior were confirmed during post-incident review. No criminal findings were made. The death was recorded as a fatal allergic reaction following known consumption of an allergen, without access to emergency medication.
It was September 14th, 2017, inside a busy downtown ice cream shop in Knoxville, Tennessee. Families and college students were winding down their evening at the tables. Behind the counter, employees prepped orders and gossiped about a viral, dangerously spicy challenge. Nobody knew how fast things would fall apart. After finishing a routine shift at his part-time job, 23-year-old Thayer Collins dropped by the shop with 2 coworkers. Thayer was a community college student working toward his HVAC certification. I respect that kind of drive. It wasn't a glamorous path, but Thayer loved hands-on work. He just wanted a stable career in a place of his own. He was a quiet, dependable guy who usually hated being the center of attention. He had mild asthma, but it was totally under control. That evening, he only agreed to the challenge because his coworker started teasing him. We've all been there, pushing our luck just because a friend egged us on. The shop had just rolled out the Reaper Scoop, a vanilla ice cream loaded with concentrated Carolina Reaper pepper extract. If you finished it in under 5 minutes, you got a free t-shirt and your photo of the Wall of Fame. The staff warned contestants about burning, cramps, and vomiting. Because so many people had done it without a real disaster, everyone assumed it was ultimately harmless. It's crazy how easily we ignore warnings when we see everyone else doing it. Thayer sat down while his buddy started recording. As the pepper extract melted, the burn set in. Witnesses said Thayer was wiping tears and shaking his head as the heat built. His face turned bright red, but he kept eating. I can't imagine enduring that kind of pain for a t-shirt. At 4 minutes, he finished the scoop. He was chugging water and joking around. Then, suddenly, he leaned way forward. Security footage showed Thayer gripping the table before throwing up on the floor. Now, I know vomiting after a spicy challenge isn't a total shocker, but Thayer couldn't stop. Witnesses described it as incredibly forceful, repeated retching. During one awful moment, while desperately trying to catch his breath, he took a sudden, sharp inhale. That single breath pulled the liquid vomit right down into his airway. Thayer doubled over, coughing violently and clutching his chest. Within minutes, it became terrifyingly obvious that something was seriously wrong. He could barely gasp, and a wet, crackling sound came from his chest. Seeing his lips turn blue, his coworker finally dialed 911. The ambulance arrived minutes later. Finding Thayer in severe respiratory distress, paramedics hooked him up to oxygen and rushed him to the ER. Doctors realized Thayer had aspirated vomit into his lungs. To put it plainly, stomach fluid had gone down the wrong pipe. That highly acidic fluid caused caused immediate severe damage to his lung tissue, and his asthma likely flared up from the shock. Thayer's condition worsened overnight. His lungs became so inflamed that he needed a ventilator, but he died 2 days later from respiratory failure. The medical examiner ruled that he died from complications caused by aspirating gastric contents. The shop permanently ended the challenge. Just weeks from graduation, Thayer was later awarded a posthumous certificate, while the local food blogger who inspired the challenge quietly deleted the original video. While Thayer's story ended at work, the next tragedy unfolded before a much smaller crowd in Batangas, where a celebration turned deadly in seconds.
It was July 9th, 2015, in Biloxi, Mississippi. Humid air stayed trapped over the casino district, while storms sat offshore through most of the night. Inside one of Biloxi's older resorts, the seafood buffet stayed crowded past midnight as tourists, casino workers, and cigarette smoke filled the narrow dining area. 38-year-old Darren Cruz had spent nearly 15 years repairing slot machines along the Gulf Coast. Most of his work happened overnight. He fixed burned wiring, jammed coin systems, and machines damaged by spilled drinks or power surges. Co-workers liked working with him because he stayed calm during problems and rarely complained during long shifts. Darren also had a shellfish allergy. He discovered it in his 20s after a few mild reactions to shrimp and crab. Doctors warned him repeated exposure could eventually trigger something much worse, even if earlier symptoms stayed manageable. But Darren stopped carrying medication years earlier because the reactions never seemed serious enough to him. And that's actually pretty common with allergies that stay mild for years. That night, maintenance crews had spent hours repairing storm-related electrical damage across the casino floor. After the work ended, management approved a late employee meal at the seafood buffet near the gaming area. Co-workers later said Darren got pulled into an ongoing competition over who could stack the biggest crab leg plate, which honestly sounds exactly like the kind of thing tired overnight crews would turn into entertainment after a long shift. The buffet was packed because flooding earlier that week had partially shut down another casino kitchen nearby. Staff rushed trays out non-stop, while customers crowded around steam tables filled with shrimp, crab, crawfish, lobster tails, and fried seafood baskets. Darren ate fast and washed everything down with bottled beer between plates. Co-workers estimated he returned to the buffet at least 5 times over about 90 minutes. By then, nobody at the table thought anything serious was happening. He remained calm and his symptoms barely looked dangerous at all. And for me, that's why severe allergic reactions catch people off guard so often. Darren kept rubbing beneath his jaw and clearing his throat between bites. Sweat started forming across his forehead even though the dining room stayed cold from heavy air conditioning. One co-worker later told investigators Darren laughed and said the crab seasoning was killing him. Looking back afterward, that joke stuck with several employees during interviews. Another co-worker noticed Darren coughing near the lobster station, but assumed food had gone down the wrong way. And a few minutes after leaving the buffet, Darren was seen vomited beside a row of slot machines near the entrance corridor and struggling to breathe. Witnesses described his breathing as loud and uneven. His eyes and cheeks had already started swelling. The reaction worsened quickly. Swelling inside Darren's throat narrowed his airway while his immune system released chemicals that triggered rapid inflammation and fluid buildup. One co-worker handed him water, believing food was stuck in his throat, and another called casino security at 12:41 a.m. Surveillance footage showed Darren collapse sideways onto the carpet less than 2 minutes later. His head struck the base of a chair before he lost consciousness. The speed of the collapse later surprised several witnesses during interviews. Casino medics arrived first with oxygen equipment. Biloxi EMS reached the resort roughly 7 minutes after the emergency call. Paramedics administered epinephrine, attempted advanced airway management, and started CPR during transport to the hospital. But once swelling closes the airway that aggressively, treatment time becomes extremely short. Darren was pronounced dead shortly after arrival. The medical examiner found severe swelling throughout Darren's airway, along with fluid inside both lungs. In simple terms, his immune system reacted so aggressively to the shellfish proteins that his airway closed faster than treatment could reverse it. His death was ruled acute shellfish-induced anaphylaxis. Afterward, casino management removed an employee challenge board near the buffet that tracked oversized seafood plates and unofficial eating records. Several co-workers later admitted Darren's early symptoms initially seemed more like part of the joke than signs of a real emergency. It was November 14th, 2015, along the waterfront in General Santos. The pier was dim, lit by weak yellow lights that barely reached the water. Most boats had docked hours earlier, leaving the area quiet, with only a few workers sitting near the edge in the still, humid night. Among them was Mario Ramos, 35, a quiet and steady worker who had only been there a few weeks. He took every extra shift he could get, rarely saying no because most of what he earned went straight to his daughter's chemotherapy treatments. That night had been especially long, stretching past 16 hours, and by the time the work slowed down, he was running on almost nothing. He hadn't eaten a proper meal all day, and the fatigue was starting to settle deep into his body. Instead of spending his last money, Mario noticed small fish gathering near the dock lights. It wasn't unusual, and without thinking much, he grabbed a nearby net and scooped a handful in one motion. Another worker joined him, then a third, and within minutes they had enough for a quick meal. They rinsed the fish in seawater but didn't sort them carefully. Under the dim light, everything looked the same, small, silver, and easy to mistake. Someone added vinegar and salt, mixed it in a plastic container, and they ate together, passing it around without a second thought. At first, nothing seemed off. The conversation continued, low and tired, as they sat along the dock. After some time, Mario paused mid-sentence. He brought his fingers to his lips and rubbed them together, then wiped his hand on his shirt. His jaw moved unevenly, like chewing had suddenly become difficult to control. He tried to keep talking, but his words started to come out slurred, not matching what he was trying to say. One of the others laughed at first, thinking he was just exhausted, maybe lightheaded from the long shift. Across from him, another worker went quiet. He shifted his weight and braced one hand on the dock, adjusting his posture as if trying to steady himself. His fingers began flexing repeatedly, opening and closing in short, uncontrolled movements. Mario tried to stand, pushing himself up with one hand, but his legs gave out immediately. He collapsed back down, unable to hold his weight. Another worker staggered backward, hitting a crate behind him before dropping to his knees. The third man, who had eaten less than the others, began breathing faster, then unevenly, like his chest wasn't working the way it should. That was when the panic started to spread. From a distance, it didn't look like choking. No one was grabbing their throat or gasping for air in a way people usually recognize. Instead, their bodies were shutting down in stages. First their speech, then their movement, and then their breathing started to weaken. One worker tried to pull Mario from the dock, but his strength gave out and he collapsed beside him. Someone called for help, using a mobile phone from the loading area nearby, but by then, 2 men were already unresponsive. When responders arrived roughly 10 to 15 minutes later, they found both men lying supine on the dock, with shallow or absent breathing and weak pulses. Basic airway support and oxygen were initiated on site, but neither regained effective respiration. Post-incident reports identified tetrodotoxin exposure, a small pufferfish, visually similar in size and color to the other catch under low light, had been included in the mixture and consumed. The toxin blocks voltage-gated sodium channels, preventing nerve signals from reaching muscles. This leads to progressive paralysis, starting with facial numbness and loss of coordination, followed by limb weakness and eventually respiratory muscle failure. There are no visible external injuries. 2 workers were pronounced dead at the scene. A third survived after intensive care. The case was recorded as accidental food poisoning from a toxic marine species. Afterward, warnings were issued against eating unsorted small fish, especially at night when visibility is low. It was August 17th, 2015. A cramped apartment in Stockton, California, sat quiet in the afternoon heat, curtains drawn against the summer sun. Inside, 2-year-old Noah Bennett played alone on the living room floor, while his mother sat slumped on the couch with an empty vodka bottle beside her. Noah was a typical toddler, energetic and curious, with no known medical conditions or developmental issues. His pediatric records showed he was slightly underweight, but otherwise healthy. Jessica, his mother, had been raising him alone since his father left 9 months earlier, working irregular shifts at a distribution warehouse while struggling with alcohol dependency. Child Protective Services had received 2 anonymous reports about her drinking, but closed both cases after brief home visits found no immediate danger. Friends described Jessica as overwhelmed and increasingly isolated, often appearing intoxicated during daytime hours. Young children lack the sophisticated swallowing mechanics adults possess. Their airways are narrower, approximately the diameter of a toddler's pinky finger, and their gag reflexes are less developed. Foods like whole grapes, hot dogs, and hard candies pose extreme choking risks because they can create complete airway obstructions that block all oxygen flow. Pediatric guidelines explicitly warn against giving children under 4 any food larger than a pea, or foods with tough, slippery skins that cannot be compressed. That afternoon, Jessica had been drinking since 11 in the morning. By 2:30 in the afternoon, she was severely intoxicated, her blood alcohol content later measured at 0.18%. She prepared Noah's lunch carelessly, placing a bowl of whole seedless grapes and thick-cut hot dog chunks on the coffee table before collapsing onto the couch. No supervision, no cutting the food into safe pieces. Noah, likely hungry and unsupervised, began eating while his mother passed out beside him. The apartment was silent except for the hum of a box fan. Noah sat cross-legged on the carpet, reaching for the grapes. At approximately 2:45 in the afternoon, he placed a whole grape in his mouth and attempted to swallow. The grape, measuring roughly 3/4 of an inch in diameter, lodged perfectly at the entrance to his airway, creating an airtight seal. There was no dramatic choking, no violent coughing. The complete obstruction prevented any air movement that would trigger those reflexes. Noah simply froze, his small hands moving to his throat. His face darkened from pink to deep red, then began turning dusky blue as oxygen deprivation progressed. He stood briefly, staggered 2 steps toward the couch, then collapsed onto his side beside the furniture. His mother remained unconscious throughout. Noah's brain had been deprived of oxygen for several minutes, leaving him unresponsive and leading to cardiac arrest. His small body lay on the carpet, fingers still slightly curled, while Jessica slept. Hours later, a neighbor who had come by to drop off a casserole peeked through the curtains and saw the toddler, immediately calling 911. Officers arrived shortly after and forced entry, and paramedics followed 4 minutes later, quickly determining that the child had been dead for hours. The medical examiner's autopsy revealed a single intact green grape wedged in the upper airway, completely blocking the passage of air. No food particles were found in the lungs. Cause of death was mechanical asphyxia due to foreign body airway obstruction. The warm apartment accelerated the onset of livor and rigor mortis, which investigators noted during the initial examination. Jessica was arrested that evening and charged with involuntary manslaughter and child endangerment resulting in death. The apartment was cleared within 48 hours. Noah's blue sippy cup remained on the floor near where he fell, collected as evidence along with the bowl of grapes. Thanks for watching. If you like these stories, click here.
It was April 12th, 2014, over in Cagliari, Sardinia. The summer evening air carried the smell of grilled seafood and wine from all the outdoor tables overlooking the harbor. The waterfront was packed with tourists, and local musicians were playing nearby. And it felt like the perfect summer night, the kind of evening you remember for all the right reasons. In the middle of that crowd was 28-year-old Montgomery Monty Lopez, an Australian travel photographer documenting traditional foods across Europe. Monty was adventurous, outgoing, and always hunting for the wildest experiences. That drive is what makes a great creator. That night, a local guide invited him to a private gathering outside the city featuring Casu Marzu, a controversial Sardinian cheese containing live insect larvae. When the cheese wheel was opened, several guests stepped back because the inside was literally moving. Hundreds of tiny white maggots were squirming through the soft cheese, and some were so active they were launching themselves several inches into the air. Locals were actually shielding their eyes while serving it. Monty was fascinated. He spent nearly 20 minutes filming close-up footage, joking that the food looked alive because, technically, it was. Now, this is where the story gets frustrating. One older guest explicitly warned him not to eat it, explaining that if the larvae appeared unhealthy or the cheese had been stored incorrectly, dangerous bacteria could grow inside. Another guest even said they should throw the whole wheel away because it looked way too old. But Monty just brushed off the warnings and came up with what he thought was a smart fix. Using a knife, he carefully scraped away the visible larvae from his portion, laughing that if the maggots were the problem, you just had to remove them. It's wild how common sense can completely fail you when you don't know the whole story. What Monty didn't get was that the danger wasn't the insects, it was the invisible bacteria already contaminating the cheese. He ate several large pieces and felt completely fine for the rest of the night. But by the next afternoon, severe stomach cramps hit him out of nowhere, followed by violent vomiting and a high fever. His friends figured it was just basic food poisoning and told him to rest. By the second day, he couldn't even stand. He was completely dehydrated and confused, and when he finally got to the ER, doctors immediately knew it was a massive bacterial infection. The bacteria had leaked into his bloodstream, spreading through his entire body. Doctors flooded him with antibiotics, but his blood pressure suddenly crashed, and his organs began shutting down. He had gone into septic shock. Monty was rushed to the ICU on life support while his family flew in from Australia, but the damage was irreversible. 4 days after eating the cheese, Monty passed away. Following Monty's death, local health authorities investigated the gathering and examined the remaining cheese. Officials concluded that the wheel had likely been improperly stored, allowing dangerous bacteria to grow. Because the event was informal and there was no evidence anyone knowingly served contaminated food, no criminal charges were filed. What bothers me most is that Monty thought he had solved the problem. He removed the visible larvae, never realizing the real danger was the bacteria he couldn't see. One mistake cost him his life. The next story shows that danger doesn't always come from something exotic. Sometimes it's just 12 wings and a cash prize.
It was the 1st of January, 2013 in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. The streets glittered on the night with fireworks cracking above Copacabana Beach, and somewhere high above the crowd, inside a penthouse with a perfect view of it all, a dinner party was about to become something else entirely. Eduardo Vasconcelos, 58 years old, a senior industrial figure with long-standing interests tied to Brazil's extractive and export logistics sectors. Ricardo Almeida, 62 years old, was hosting a New Year's Day celebration in his home. He was Eduardo's long-term associate involved in freight coordination and bulk mineral export arrangements spanning several years. Their relationship that evening was informal, shaped more by familiarity than hierarchy or negotiation. Ricardo had visited Eduardo's residence in São Paulo days earlier on Christmas Day. That visit had been uneventful, reinforcing the expectation that Eduardo's presence in Rio would be routine and socially oriented rather than operationally significant. The invitation-only gathering had been assembled with deliberate restraint. It was not structured as a conventional celebration, but as a closed-door meeting space for figures connected to Brazil's mining exports, port logistics, and infrastructure finance networks. The guest list reflected that industrial alignment. Senior executives from iron ore operations in Minas Gerais and Pará, port terminal administrators from Brazil's southeast coast, and commodity-linked financiers formed small conversational clusters across the room. Discussions moved fluidly between market positioning, shipping constraints, and the early outlook for Asian steel demand in the coming year. A private chef had been commissioned for the evening, preparing a menu built around imported luxury ingredients rarely served outside high-end restaurants. Courses were paced slowly around discussion, port throughput, contract renewals, and shipping capacity projections. Among the final dishes was Chilean sea bass accompanied by a lobster beurre blanc made from imported cold water lobster, one of the most expensive plates served that evening. As midnight passed and the new year began, the final savory course was served. Eduardo chose the sea bass with lobster beurre blanc. Several guests later recalled him complimenting the dish shortly before the reaction began. He had never been told by a doctor that he was allergic to shellfish, but people who knew him later remembered that he had felt a slight irritation in his mouth after eating seafood more than once. Each time, the feeling was small, went away quickly. He never went to see a doctor about it. Several minutes later, Eduardo paused mid-sentence, cleared his throat, and took a sip of water. At first, the reaction appeared minor, easily attributed to dryness or fatigue, and no immediate attention was drawn to it in the crowded setting. Within a short interval, the change became more distinct. Swallowing became difficult, his breathing shifted subtly, and visible flushing developed across his face and neck. A security staff member trained in basic emergency response noticed the change in posture before most guests did. As lip swelling appeared and speech became strained, the staff member approached and signaled for attention. The security staff member noticed before most guests did. "I find that worth acknowledging. That kind of attention matters. Within minutes, breathing difficulty became evident, and Eduardo leaned forward with one hand rising toward his throat. Emergency services were contacted immediately, but New Year's Day crowds near Copacabana Beach affected emergency access significantly. On-site security provided basic first aid while waiting for paramedics, but symptoms had already progressed beyond the initial phase. Paramedics arrived after a delayed transit through congested holiday conditions and initiated advanced airway management before transporting him to a nearby hospital. The doctors said his symptoms matched a severe allergic reaction, most likely set off by shellfish proteins found in the lobster sauce he had eaten earlier. Eduardo Vasconcelos was pronounced dead shortly after midnight. The cause of death was recorded as anaphylactic shock secondary to shellfish exposure, with a contributing delay in medical stabilization due to extreme holiday congestion.